Lower your voice. Lean in. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the rooms where it was spoken. There are names in American history that shine like polished marble, clean, heroic, untouched. And then there are names deliberately kept in shadow, because they knew too much. This is one of them. Elizabeth KECKLEY. If you've heard her name at all, you were told a harmless version, a dressmaker, a footnote, a curiosity. That lie was intentional, because the most dangerous witnesses are never the men who sign documents or give speeches. They are the ones who stand silent in the corner, while power forgets it is being watched. In the official White House records of the Civil War, her name appears where it should not. Again and again, in private quarters, at impossible hours, present during moments when the fate of a fractured nation was being weighed by exhausted men who no longer believed their own public words. She held no title, drew no salary, left almost no paper trail, and yet she was there, closer to the Lincoln family than most generals, closer than many cabinet members, closer than history is comfortable admitting. Here is the first truth you must understand. If you want to see clearly, power does not speak freely to equals. It confesses to those it believes cannot strike back. Elizabeth KECKLEY was born enslaved. That alone trained her for a role no free man could survive. Slavery did not just steal labor, it engineered perception. It taught how to be invisible while absorbing everything, how to hear without reacting, how to remember without revealing, how to survive proximity to cruelty, grief, hypocrisy, and fear without breaking your face into betrayal. By the time she entered the White House, she had already lived several lifetimes under domination, which meant she understood something most politicians never wills. The private self is always weaker than the public mask, and weakness, when witnessed, creates dependence. For 4 years, she dressed the First Lady of the United States while the nation bled out on battlefields. She listened as reputations trembled. She saw the fractures behind the speeches. She felt the weight of secrets settle on her shoulders. Secrets that, if spoken at the wrong time, would have detonated legacies we still worship today. And then, after the war, after the blood, after the assassinations and funerals, she broke her silence once. The response was immediate, coordinated, brutal. Her book vanished. Her reputation was dismantled. And she learned the final lesson of power: some truths are not denied. They are buried. What you are about to hear is not a story about a dressmaker. It is a study in how empires trust their secrets to those they underestimate, and how silence itself becomes a weapon. Before Elizabeth KECKLEY ever touched silk in the White House, she was taught obedience with pain. This matters, because men who do not understand how power is forged in the body will never understand how it is later navigated in silence. She was born in Virginia, not into history, but into ownership. Her father was white, her mother enslaved. That single contradiction shaped her entire existence. She was proof of a system's hypocrisy made flesh. Close enough to power to be used, never close enough to be protected. From childhood, she learned that intelligence in the wrong body was a threat. Pride was punished. Awareness was beaten down until it learned to hide. At 14, she was loaned out like equipment. Not hired. Loaned. To a household where discipline meant terror, and correction meant breaking a will until it complied. The scars she carried were not only on her skin. They were neurological, behavioral. Slavery is not just chains, it is conditioning. It trains you to read rooms instantly, to detect danger before words form, to understand who is lying, who is afraid, and who is about to collapse. This is the first suppressed truth of American history. The enslaved were the most advanced psychologists in the room. Elizabeth learned to sue not as a hobby, but as leverage. Every stitch was resistance disguised as submission. Every garment was capital hidden in plain sight. While others prayed for freedom, she calculated it. Night after night, lamplight burning her eyes, fingers stiff and bleeding, she turned fabric into future autonomy. 17 years, No applause, no allies, just discipline. When she finally bought her freedom, hers and her son's, she didn't escape the system. She moved into a higher layer of it. Washington, D.C. in 1860 was not a city of ideals. It was a marketplace of influence, and influence requires proximity. Elizabeth understood this instinctively. Skill was her passport. Silence was her armor. White women trusted her with their bodies while denying her personhood. They spoke freely while she measured hems. They revealed resentments, alliances, fears, assuming the woman kneeling before them was not recording everything. This is how the unseen become dangerous, not through rebellion, through accumulation. By the time Mary Todd Lincoln walked into her shop, Elizabeth KECKLEY was already something rare and threatening, a woman shaped by oppression who had mastered self-control. She did not need to announce intelligence. She had learned when to disappear, and that is why she was invited inside the most guarded residence in the nation. Not as a guest, but as furniture that could hear. History will tell you she rose by talent. The truth is colder. She survived by becoming unreadable, and unreadable men and women are the ones power confesses to when it begins to doubt itself. Mary Todd Lincoln did not choose Elizabeth KECKLEY by accident. Power rarely does. It selects what it needs, not what it understands. When Mary crossed the threshold of that dressmaking shop in early 1861, she was already under siege. Washington society despised her. Eastern elites saw her as crude Western, unstable, an interloper who had breached circles she was never meant to enter. They mocked her accent, her spending, her family ties to the South, and behind their fans and smiles, they sharpened knives. Mary needed more than a dressmaker. She needed containment. Elizabeth recognized it immediately. The frantic eyes, the compulsive control, the desperation to be transformed into something acceptable before the scrutiny became lethal. Clothing, in that era, was not decoration, it was signaling rank, stability, belonging. A misjudged gown could destroy a woman socially faster than a public scandal. "I need to look like I belong," Mary said. What she meant was, "I am afraid they will devour me." Elizabeth did not reassure her. She did not overpromise. She offered competence, precision, silence, and that was enough. Because competence creates dependence when fear is already present. From that moment forward, the White House was no longer just a political center. It became a pressure chamber. And Elizabeth KECKLEY was allowed inside the private core, not because she was trusted as an equal, but because she was presumed incapable of betrayal. That presumption would shape everything. Inside those rooms, Elizabeth witnessed the unfiltered version of power. Not speeches, not proclamations, but panic, rage, grief. Mary Lincoln's mood swings were not theatrical. They were the psychological fallout of isolation, suspicion, and chemically dulled nerves. Laudanum flowed freely. So did confessions, debts hidden from Congress, letters burned, accusations whispered at night. Elizabeth heard them all. She watched as the First Lady was accused, quietly, then openly, of Confederate sympathies because her brothers fought for the South. She saw how quickly loyalty was questioned when optics demanded sacrifice. And she learned a brutal rule of institutions. When survival is at stake, truth is negotiable. Abraham Lincoln, too, changed in those halls, not into a monument, but into something hollowed by responsibility. Elizabeth saw him not as history later carved him, but as a man pacing floors at night, questioning whether the Republic could be preserved without becoming something unrecognizable. And always, she stood nearby, adjusting cuffs, pinning fabric. Invisible. Here is the second truth they never taught you: the inner circle of power is not composed of the loudest voices. It is built around those who hear everything and say nothing. Elizabeth KECKLEY became indispensable not because she spoke, but because she absorbed. And once you become the vessel for another's secrets, you are never allowed to be free again. Not even in silence. War strips institutions the way hunger strips men. It exposes what was always there, waiting, By the summer of 1861, Washington was no longer pretending. The city hardened. Soldiers filled the streets like moving barricades. Conversations dropped to whispers. And the White House, once porous, almost careless, began to seal itself from the outside world, but not from Elizabeth Keckley. She moved through that building with a freedom no uniformed man possessed. Guards nodded. Doors opened, not because she was powerful, but because she was familiar. And familiarity is one of power's greatest blind spots. Inside the private quarters, the rituals of state collapsed into human strain. Elizabeth saw how decisions presented to the public, as moral certainties were born from exhaustion, fear, and calculation. She learned that leadership at its core is not conviction. It is endurance under contradiction. One evening, while adjusting a gown, she witnessed something that would never enter the official record. Abraham Lincoln unguarded, questioning not the enemy, but himself. The deaths weighed on him. The letters from mothers. The arithmetic of loss. And in that moment, he did not speak as a president. He spoke as a man afraid that history might judge him as a tyrant disguised as a savior. Mary Lincoln tried to steady him. She spoke of destiny, of slavery's end, of meaning beyond the blood. But even that, Elizabeth understood, was framing. Narrative management begins at home. Here is the third truth hidden in plain sight. Moral outcomes are often the byproduct of strategic delay, not immediate righteousness. Lincoln knew slavery must end. He also knew when saying it too early would fracture the Union beyond repair. So he waited. And waiting cost lives. Elizabeth heard this not as theory, but as confession. And she said nothing, because she understood something forged into her long before Washington. Truth spoken at the wrong time is not bravery. It is suicide. Social, political, sometimes literal. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes power. As the war dragged on, Mary Lincoln's instability deepened. Grief followed her like a shadow. The loss of her son hollowed her. Her spending became frantic, almost compulsive, as if beauty could build a wall against chaos. Elizabeth saw the bills hidden, the panic behind closed doors, the fear that exposure would destroy what little control remained. And again, Elizabeth said nothing. Every secret she held tightened the invisible contract between her and the institution. She was now a risk, not because she intended harm, but because knowledge itself is dangerous when it resides outside official channels. By the end of that year, Elizabeth Keckley understood the true architecture of power. It is not built on laws. It is built on people who know when not to speak, and once you become one of them, history will never forgive you for remembering too much. By 1862, the White House was no longer merely governing a war. It was metabolizing it. Grief moved through the halls like a second atmosphere, unspoken, omnipresent, suffocating. And Elizabeth Keckley was positioned at the nerve center, where private collapse intersected with public mythology. The death of Willie Lincoln did something irreversible to the household. The nation mourned symbolically. Inside those walls, the mourning was feral. Mary Lincoln unraveled in stages, first denial, then fixation, then despair sharpened into paranoia. Spiritualists were summoned. Seances conducted in candlelit rooms, while the war thundered on outside. Men in uniform died by the thousands while the First Lady searched for proof that death was not final. Elizabeth was there, not as a believer, not as a skeptic, but as a witness. She held Mary as the body convulsed with grief. She listened to sobs that could not be heard by advisors or generals. And she learned another forbidden truth. Institutions collapse when the private lives of their figureheads collapse. So those private lives must be concealed at all costs. This is where the machinery of suppression began to tighten. Mary Lincoln's behavior, her spending, her emotional volatility, her reliance on laudanum, became a liability. Rumors circulated quietly. Elizabeth heard them forming before they reached print. The solution was not help. It was containment. The White House closed ranks. Information was controlled. Narratives were shaped. And Elizabeth, again, was essential. She was trusted with the physical evidence of instability. Garments ordered impulsively, altered repeatedly, discarded in moments of panic. She knew the scale of the debt. She knew how desperately Mary feared exposure, and because Elizabeth herself existed one scandal away from ruin, she was the perfect vault. Here is the fourth truth you were never taught. Systems do not protect truth. They protect continuity. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the public absorbed it as moral thunder. Elizabeth heard the quieter context, the timing, the political calculus, the need for a victory to justify it. Liberation was real, but it was also leveraged, and that duality disturbed her more than outright cruelty ever had. Because it meant freedom, even when granted, could still be instrumentalized. Elizabeth stood between two worlds that never truly touched. To the enslaved, Lincoln was a deliverer. To the Union, a strategist. To himself, a man gambling with history. She saw all three, and understood that none were complete truths on their own. And then came the realization that changed everything. If she ever spoke fully, she would be accused of betrayal by every side. Too loyal to the Lincolns to be believed by radicals, too black to be believed by elites, too close to power to be forgiven for revealing it. So she learned the final discipline. To survive history, you must sometimes let it lie, and that decision, to remember without revealing, was the moment Elizabeth KECKLEY stopped being merely a witness and became a threat. Assassination rewrites reality faster than truth can react. When Abraham Lincoln was killed, the nation froze into myth almost instantly. Mourning became choreography. Memory was edited in real time, and anyone who carried an unfiltered version of the man, or the marriage, or the war behind the war, became a liability overnight. Elizabeth KECKLEY felt the shift before the funeral bells finished ringing. The White House emptied, but the pressure did not. It inverted. What had once been whispered now had to be erased. Grief was permitted. Complexity was not. The Lincolns were no longer people. They were symbols, and symbols cannot be allowed contradictions. Mary Lincoln collapsed completely, not publicly. There she performed sorrow as expected, but privately she disintegrated. The one person she clung to was Elizabeth. Not a doctor, not a relative. Elizabeth. Because trauma does not reach for authority. It reaches for familiarity. Elizabeth accompanied her through the long, hollow days after the murder. She heard the looping questions, the self-blame, the accusations Mary never voiced to anyone else. She also saw the political machinery move in quietly. Advisors distanced themselves. Allies vanished. The same society that had tolerated Mary now marked her as inconvenient. Here is the fifth truth. Once power no longer needs you, it will reinterpret you. Mary's debts resurfaced. Her emotional state was reframed as instability. Sympathy curdled into suspicion, and Elizabeth, who knew exactly how much had been concealed for the sake of appearances, understood the danger. Silence had kept them safe before. Now silence was expected. But Elizabeth was no longer just holding secrets for the living. She was guarding the reputation of a dead president. That is a different order of control. In 1868, she made a choice that shocked Washington. She published her memoir, not a tell-all, not an attack, a restrained account, careful, respectful, and still too much. The backlash was immediate and coordinated. Copies were bought up and destroyed. Newspapers turned on her. Former allies cut her loose. The message was unmistakable. Proximity does not grant permission to speak. It only increases the penalty when you do. Elizabeth retreated, not in shame, but in calculation. For the next 40 years, she refused to elaborate, refused interviews, refused clarification. She let the public believe what it wanted. This was not defeat, it was strategy. Because she had learned the last rule of forbidden knowledge. Once you expose the edge of the truth, you must disappear, or be erased. Elizabeth KECKLEY chose disappearance, and in doing so, she carried something far more dangerous than scandal. She carried context. And context is what myths cannot survive. After the memoir was buried, Elizabeth Keckley entered a different kind of exile, not poverty alone, though that came, but erasure, the most dangerous kind. She was no longer attacked openly. She was ignored. And ignoring a witness is how institutions finish the job without leaving fingerprints. This is the part history skips, because it exposes an uncomfortable mechanism. Once a system extracts what it needs from you, your labor, your silence, your proximity, it discards you without ceremony. Loyalty is not rewarded. It is consumed. Elizabeth had done everything right. She had spoken carefully. She had protected names. She had refused to sensationalize grief. It didn't matter. The problem was not what she said. The problem was that she had demonstrated she could speak at all. From that moment forward, her survival depended on restraint more severe than slavery ever demanded. She lived the remainder of her life with knowledge she could never safely release. Knowledge about how emancipation was negotiated, about how grief was managed for optics, about how a presidency was stabilized by unseen labor, emotional, psychological, and racialized. Here is the sixth truth you were never taught: revolutions are not maintained by ideals. They are stabilized by caretakers who never appear in portraits. Elizabeth returned to teaching sewing to young black women. On the surface, it looked like retreat. In reality, it was transmission. She taught discipline, precision, self-command, the same tools that had purchased her freedom and protected her mind. She did not teach bitterness. She taught mastery, because she understood something most men never learn until it's too late. The only power that cannot be confiscated is internal. When she died in 1907, Washington barely noticed. No state funeral, no commemorations. The silence was complete, and that too was intentional, because honoring her would require acknowledging what she represented. A woman-born property who moved through the highest levels of power without ever being fully seen, yet saw everything. Ask yourself why her name is not carved into marble. Ask yourself why her account is treated as controversial instead of indispensable. It is because she disrupts the preferred narrative. She proves that history is not shaped only by speeches and battles, but by those trained to listen while standing just outside the spotlight. Elizabeth Keckley understood the architecture of control long before the term existed. Psychological containment, narrative management, strategic silence. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient tools refined by empires that cannot afford transparency, and she mastered them. Not to dominate, but to endure. The danger of her story is not what she revealed once. It is what she proved by refusing to reveal the rest. Because the most destabilizing idea of all is this: the truth does not disappear when it is suppressed. It simply waits, inside the minds of those strong enough to carry it without speaking. And once you recognize that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. If you've followed me this far, you can feel it. The pressure behind the story. This is no longer about Elizabeth Keckley as a person. This is about the system that required her to exist exactly as she did. Silent, capable, invisible, and it is still operating. Here is where the descent deepens. Elizabeth's greatest value to power was not her loyalty. It was her self-regulation. She had been conditioned, first by slavery, then by elite proximity, to control her reactions completely. No outrage, no collapse, no uncontrolled emotion. That made her safer than any sworn official, because oaths can be broken. Conditioning rarely is. This is the seventh truth, and it is one men must understand if they want mastery. Systems do not fear anger. They fear discipline paired with awareness. Elizabeth had both. She saw how public narratives are manufactured after events, not during them. The war ended. Lincoln was sanctified. Emancipation was simplified. Complexity was stripped away so the nation could stabilize its identity. The messiness, the bargaining, the delays, the personal failures had to be removed for the myth to function, and Elizabeth was living evidence of that messiness. She knew freedom was real, but conditional. She knew suffering could be politically useful. She knew that moral language is often applied retroactively to decisions made under fear. These realizations do not make someone cynical. They make them dangerous to illusions. This is why she was never rehabilitated historically. You cannot integrate a witness like her without destabilizing the story men tell themselves about power, virtue, and control. Now listen carefully, because this is the moment most viewers miss. Halfway through this descent, you are no longer just learning history. You are being tested. If you understand what Elizabeth represented, if you recognize the pattern still active today, mark yourself. Not for me, for yourself. In the comments, write this phrase twice. I see the unseen. I see the unseen. Do it deliberately, because identity follows declaration, and attention follows commitment. Back to the descent. Elizabeth KECKLEY proved that proximity to power does not require permission, only usefulness. She also proved the cost. Once you become a container for truths that cannot be spoken, you are separated from ordinary life. Relationships thin. Recognition vanishes. Peace becomes internal, not external. This is why her later years appear quiet, almost small. That is another illusion. Silence is not absence. It is containment. She had crossed a psychological threshold few ever do. She understood power without desiring to wield it publicly. That is the difference between rulers and survivors of rulers. And that understanding, once internalized, cannot be undone. From this point forward, every section will strip away another comfort, another myth, another lie hidden in plain sight. Because Elizabeth KECKLEY's final secret was not what she knew about the past. It was what her life reveals about the present, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now we move past biography and into mechanism. Elizabeth KECKLEY's life exposes a structure most men sense, but cannot name. Power does not operate vertically alone. It operates laterally, through rooms adjacent to authority, through people who are never elected, appointed, or remembered. The real leverage points are not always at the top. They are beside the bed, behind the curtain, at the edge of the conversation. This is where institutions actually stabilize themselves. Elizabeth was not unique because she was close to Lincoln. She was unique because she understood the role she was being shaped into and accepted it without illusion. She did not mistake proximity for protection. She did not confuse access with loyalty. She treated the White House the way a veteran treats hostile terrain: observant, disciplined, emotionally armored. Here is the eighth truth. Power rewards those who do not demand credit. Men who seek recognition become predictable. Men who seek control reveal themselves, but those who operate without visible ambition, they are allowed to remain. Elizabeth watched how crises were softened before being released to the public. How grief was framed as nobility. How chaos was translated into ceremony. This is narrative alchemy, the conversion of disorder into legitimacy, and it requires witnesses who will never interrupt the spell. She also learned that institutions do not remember service. They remember risk. After the assassination, Elizabeth became a risk simply by existing with memory intact, not because she was hostile, but because she was unmanageable. You cannot audit a mind that has chosen silence. You cannot subpoena restraint. So the system did what it always does: it isolated her economically, socially, historically. This pattern repeats across time. The intelligence analyst who knows too much but signs no report. The aide who hears the unfiltered version of policy. The fixer who solves crises before they become scandals. They are never celebrated. They are contained. Elizabeth's retreat into teaching was not humility. It was strategic withdrawal. She redirected her knowledge into something that could not be confiscated: skill transmission. Teaching young black women mastery over their hands, their posture, their work ethic. Teaching them how to move through hostile systems without announcing themselves as threats. This is how suppressed knowledge actually survives. Not through archives, but through behavior. Ask yourself why certain forms of discipline are never taught openly anymore. Why self-command is replaced with expression. Why emotional release is encouraged, while emotional control is pathologized. Elizabeth would have recognized this immediately, because she knew something that destabilizes every modern narrative of empowerment. The man or woman who cannot regulate themselves will always be regulated by something else, and the system prefers it that way. Her silence was not submission. It was sovereignty exercised internally. And that is why her story was never meant to reach you this way, because once you see how power truly circulates, through restraint, proximity, and disciplined invisibility, you stop chasing symbols, you start mastering yourself, and that is where institutions lose their grip. By 1863, the war had reached a grinding, relentless tempo. Soldiers bled by the tens of thousands. Families dissolved in grief. Newspapers screamed with propaganda. And yet the private machinery of the White House barely slowed. Elizabeth KECKLEY was inside this engine, unseen, calculating, absorbing. She saw the subtle levers of control, who received attention, who was dismissed, how decisions were masked as inevitability rather than choice. And she understood one of the harshest rules of power. Proximity grants knowledge, but it does not grant immunity. The deeper truth she carried was psychological. Grief and terror were tools, not in the sense of cruelty, but as mechanisms of compliance. Mary Lincoln's despair, once externalized in the public sphere, could have delegitimized the presidency. But contained, managed, and mediated by someone like Elizabeth, it became a hidden stabilizer. A private operator's job, ensure that chaos does not leak where it could shatter the system. And here is the ninth truth. The stability of any institution is maintained less by laws than by those trained to absorb its trauma without interference. Elizabeth understood the calculus. She saw Abraham Lincoln at his most vulnerable, pacing, sleepless, haunted by letters of parents whose children were dead. He confessed to Mary, in moments Elizabeth alone could witness, that the nation's survival sometimes required moral compromises he would not allow himself to announce publicly. It was not ambition, it was calculation. The kind of calculation that only those who stand at the center of catastrophe can recognize. Immediate action can kill the larger mission. Patience can kill innocence, but inaction can kill you. Elizabeth absorbed every confession, every hesitation, every tremor of fear. She did not react. She did not judge. She cataloged. She became a human ledger of moral compromise. Every misstep, every unspoken truth, every panic hidden from public scrutiny she knew, and she carried them silently. This is why her memoir, when published in 1868, was incendiary. Not because she lied, but because she reminded the nation of its unspoken history. She forced acknowledgement that power is not exercised in sunlight alone, and for that, the system retaliated. Books were destroyed, reputation was targeted. She was exiled from the narrative she had helped safeguard. Yet Elizabeth persisted. 40 years of careful silence followed. And in that silence, she perfected the most dangerous skill of all: absolute self-mastery under pressure. If you want to recognize power today, learn this: it rarely resides in authority. It resides in the patient, disciplined witness who sees everything, moves invisibly, and knows the cost of speaking too soon. The system fears that witness more than any enemy, and that is exactly the role Elizabeth KECKLEY mastered. By the time Elizabeth KECKLEY reached the later decades of her life, her existence had become a quiet battlefield. She lived in plain sight, yet the weight she carried was immeasurable. Her knowledge, the catalog of grief, failure, calculation, and hidden truths, was a weapon she could never wield openly. And therein lies the 11th truth. The most dangerous knowledge is knowledge you do not use, because it accumulates inside you until it becomes an unspoken authority. Her memoir, Behind the Scenes, was meant to reveal some of that knowledge, but the backlash was swift and systematic. Copies were purchased and destroyed. Friends distanced themselves. Society's gaze turned hostile. This is the invisible hand of control at work. When someone threatens to reveal inconvenient truths, the system does not negotiate. It isolates, erases, and manipulates perception. History itself becomes a tool. Elizabeth retreated into teaching. But this was not defeat. It was deliberate, tactical withdrawal. The young women she trained learned more than sewing. They learned precision, discipline, the art of invisibility, and how to navigate hostile spaces without attracting attention. She was transmitting an understanding of power that could survive decades of suppression. The knowledge she could not speak aloud was encoded in hands, in posture, in movement, in the quiet but exact execution of skill. This is where the psychological architecture of influence becomes apparent. Institutions depend on those who observe and do not interfere. They rely on witnesses who carry memory without rebellion, and they fear those who could speak because their very knowledge destabilizes the illusion of control. Elizabeth was one of those witnesses. She knew, more than anyone, how perception shapes reality and how secrecy shapes outcomes. She understood that wars are not won by armies alone, but by those who ensure the machinery behind decisions runs without collapse. By the time of her death in 1907, the public had largely forgotten her. Newspapers barely mentioned her passing. Her influence was invisible, but indelible. She had shaped minds, mediated grief, contained secrets, and transmitted the tools for survival and mastery. And yet, she remained unknown, because society cannot afford to acknowledge the invisible operators who stabilize its myths. This is the 12th truth. True power often manifests not in conquest, but in endurance, in the disciplined containment of knowledge, in the silent mastery of what others cannot see. Elizabeth KECKLEY did not merely survive history, she mastered it. And now, the real question confronts you. Are you willing to carry knowledge in silence, to see what others ignore, to endure what others cannot bear? Because that is what separates the observers from the masters. Elizabeth KECKLEY's life teaches a lesson most men never confront. Proximity to power is not privilege. It is responsibility. You are not safe because you are near authority. You are vulnerable because you see what most cannot, and what most will never acknowledge. Every whispered confession, every unguarded moment, every fracture in the public facade is a liability, and the system always knows who is carrying it. By the late 19th century, Elizabeth understood this more clearly than ever. She had been trained, first by slavery, then by the White House, to process trauma without reacting. That skill became her shield. It allowed her to survive when others would have been destroyed by knowledge, but survival required constant vigilance. Every memory of Mary Lincoln's panic, every glimpse of Abraham Lincoln's exhaustion, every mismanaged crisis she had witnessed, it had to remain compartmentalized, invisible. One slip, one casual disclosure, and decades of carefully constructed containment would have collapsed like a house of cards. This is the 13th truth. Knowledge is power, but only if it is disciplined. Uncontrolled knowledge is a liability. Mismanaged observation is suicide. The human mind, when exposed to unfiltered history, can fracture. Elizabeth learned how to prevent that fracture, not just in herself, but in the people around her. She became a stabilizer of systems, a silent guardian of legacies, a container for secrets too dangerous to release. And yet, even in silence, she influenced outcomes. The young women she taught carried not just sewing skills, but a coded awareness of discipline, discretion, and psychological resilience. She transmitted an understanding of the hidden rules of authority, how to navigate power without being crushed by it, how to make yourself indispensable without asking for recognition, how to absorb chaos and remain unbroken. These lessons are invisible, but they ripple through generations. They are more potent than any speech, more lasting than any law. The deeper realization is this: institutions do not fail because of public scandal. They fail because the invisible operators, the witnesses, the containers, the disciplined silent ones, are ignored, underestimated, or removed. Elizabeth KECKLEY survived because she mastered herself. She endured because she understood that secrecy is not merely avoidance, it is control. She observed the machinery of governance, grief, and war, and she became part of it without surrendering her mind to it. This is the final preparatory truth before we descend further. Mastery begins where others see only chaos, and Elizabeth KECKLEY spent her life turning chaos into quiet authority, invisibility into influence, trauma into unspoken strength. The question now becomes personal. Can you recognize the systems that demand your silence, the truths too dangerous to speak, and still move through them unbroken? Because that is the path she walked, and it is the path you must understand if you want to truly see the unseen. By now, you should sense the patterns. History is less about the men in public view, and more about the invisible operators who sustain it. Elizabeth KECKLEY was one of the most potent of these operators. Her value lay not in her proximity to power, but in her mastery of restraint, observation, and psychological containment. She understood the unspoken currency that governs human behavior at the highest levels: silence, discipline, unflinching attention. Consider the subtle ways she influenced the Lincoln presidency without anyone knowing. Every gown she tailored, every adjustment she made, every private conversation she witnessed, all were leverage, not for herself, but for the stability of the people and the institution she served. She could have exposed Mary Lincoln's debts, mental strain, and reckless spending. She could have publicized Abraham Lincoln's doubts, his moments of despair, his raw calculation. But she did not. She understood that truth untempered by timing and discretion is destruction. She became the vessel that held the chaos, so others could perform the illusion of order. This is the 14th truth. Power is rarely exercised by those who shout. It is exercised by those who absorb, contain, and control the information others cannot handle. And because they do this quietly, their influence is invisible but absolute. Elizabeth KECKLEY's life proves it. The White House functioned not only because of Lincoln's leadership, but because someone existed to witness, measure, and absorb the vulnerabilities of those at the top. The moral dimension of this lesson is critical. Silence is not submission. Discipline is not obedience. Knowledge is not always to be wielded. Elizabeth understood that mastery of self, and the ability to remain unreadable, makes a person untouchable in ways the overtly ambitious can never achieve. The young women she trained, the students she influenced, inherited not only skill, but insight into the architecture of authority. They learned to survive systems designed to break them, and to navigate corridors of power invisible to those blinded by status or noise. Her story also exposes the cost of visibility. Every historian, journalist, and contemporary critic who sought to define her life misunderstood the nature of her influence. They assumed that relevance requires presence. Elizabeth proved otherwise. True relevance is internal. It is endurance. It is knowing without revealing. It is becoming indispensable without being acknowledged. And now, having seen her mastery, consider yourself tested. Can you absorb what others cannot? Can you carry knowledge without displaying it, mastering systems without claiming them, navigating chaos without collapsing? This is the final threshold before the last revelation, because what Elizabeth KECKLEY teaches us is not just survival, it is the art of becoming a hidden force. And once you reach that level, the world will never see you, but it will always feel your influence. We arrive at the deepest truth Elizabeth KECKLEY's life reveals, the one they never teach in classrooms, never discuss in public forums, and never want you to fully understand. Knowledge without restraint is dangerous. Power without subtlety is fleeting. And influence is rarely granted. It is earned silently through observation, endurance, and disciplined containment of what others cannot handle. Elizabeth KECKLEY spent her life navigating the invisible architecture of authority. She witnessed the raw, unfiltered despair of Abraham Lincoln, the sleepless nights, the letters from grieving mothers, the moral calculations that no public record captured. She observed Mary Lincoln's spiraling grief and financial desperation, the compulsive attempts to assert control in a world slipping into chaos. And she did not act impulsively. She did not gossip. She did not judge. She absorbed it all. She became the silent lever that kept fragile systems intact. Here is the 15th and most dangerous truth. Those who truly master influence rarely seek it. They survive because they are indispensable, not because they are recognized. They shape outcomes without ever claiming credit. They witness history without rewriting it for personal gain, and in that space, between observation and action, they acquire a freedom invisible to those who chase recognition, applause, or status. Elizabeth's 40-year silence after publishing her memoir was not defeat. It was mastery. It was a deliberate act of control over narrative, timing, and perception. In choosing when and how to reveal, or withhold, truth, she retained power no official title could grant. She protected herself and the legacies of others, understanding that the system punishes exposure more harshly than failure. She had learned the ultimate rule: knowledge is only dangerous when mishandled. When contained, it is invincible. Think about this in modern terms. Systems today operate the same way as in the Lincoln White House. Public displays distract. Media manipulates. Institutions survive by relying on those who know more than they reveal. People who see, hear, and understand without reacting. These are the invisible operators. They are the custodians of continuity, the silent stabilizers of chaos, the unseen masters of influence. Elizabeth KECKLEY's legacy is a blueprint for survival and power. Cultivate observation, discipline your mind, master your presence, and learn to carry truths that would destroy ordinary people. Endure without acknowledgement. Influence without exposure. Protect without expectation. And once you internalize this, once you begin walking the same path of quiet mastery, you understand why history fears witnesses like Elizabeth KECKLEY, because she proves that ultimate authority does not always reside in those who command the room, but in those who stand silently at the edge of it, absorbing everything, speaking nothing, and shaping the world in ways no one will ever see, but everyone will feel. Welcome to the descent. You have reached the edge. Now you understand true power is invisible, disciplined, and eternal.